There is a part of the Watergate scandal that history has largely forgotten. 9 months before they broke into the Watergate Hotel, the three so-called White House plumbers got their start with a different break-in. White House aide Gordon Liddy was sent to Los Angeles to spy on a psychiatrist's office. And to give you a sense of how secretive it was, Liddy wore a wig, carried a fake ID, and had special shoes that made it look like he had a limp. And the plumber's target was the psychiatrist of the man who had leaked the Pentagon Papers, Daniel Ellsberg. Gordon Liddy and the rest of the White House plumbers hired CIA-connected Cuban nationals to physically break into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's filing cabinet with a crowbar. They were trying to find evidence that Ellsberg was mentally unstable to use against him and stop his leaking. And that's why they were called the White House plumbers. And in 2007, one of them explained in the New York Times why he did what he did in that first break-in. Quote, "At no time did I or anyone else there question whether the operation was necessary, legal, or moral. The premise of our action was the strongly held view with certain precincts of the White House that the president and those functioning on his behalf could carry out illegal acts with impunity if they were convinced that the nation's security demanded it." Now, stop here for a second and think, if that logic rings a bell, it might be because it is so strongly echoing the logic of the three individuals indicted in Georgia for their alleged breaching of voting systems in Coffee County. They thought they were helping the president defend democracy. Joining us now is Michael Conway, who was one of the House Judiciary Committee's lawyers during their investigation into Watergate. And he just wrote an op-ed on MSNBC.com about how the Coffee County defendants brought Watergate energy to Georgia. Michael, thank you so much for being with us tonight. So fascinating piece that you wrote. I think a lot of people who certainly don't know the history of Watergate in its entirety are going to benefit from this conversation. But talk to me more about the fact that Coffee County officials didn't try to conceal their activities, and that the idea they might have thought they were doing the right thing by helping the then president.
Well, absolutely. It was very blatant. The security cameras, as you pointed out, showed them being escorted right into the voting machine area that's secure from the public, and it showed them actually tampering with the machines. One of the three has said in an audio recording that was discovered in a civil lawsuit that they imaged the computers of all the voting equipment. They scanned all the ballots, and they were very blatant about what they were doing. And they purport to contend that they had, quote, permission, close quote, to do this. But of course they didn't. It's against the law. And the only person who could give them that access would have been the Secretary of State in Georgia, and he definitely didn't do that. He investigated them when that recording became public.
There's an interesting dynamic here that runs parallel to Watergate, in that Trump has hinted at a willingness to pardon January 6 rioters and others who supported his election denialism. It's become a popular phrase of his at campaign rallies and speeches. Does that attitude from the former president ring any bells for you?
Well, the cathedral bells are going off. Back in Watergate, in the Oval Office, in recordings that Nixon never believed would be made public, he talked about offering clemency to the Watergate burglars. There are so many different aspects that have parallels between Watergate and what President Trump is alleged to have done in these four indictments. For example, the president is paying the legal fees of many of his co-defendants and potential witnesses. In Watergate, more than $300,000 was raised by the White House and paid to Howard Hunt, distributed partly to his lawyer, partly to the other defendants, so that they would stay in line, keep quiet. That echoes 50 years later.
You write in your latest opinion piece for MSNBC.com, quote, "Just as the rule of law punished the guilty almost 5 decades ago, the prosecutions of those who broke the law to do Trump's bidding must succeed in order to preserve our democracy." What would that mean for... Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, absolutely true. In a way, we could look at these kind of bumbling attempts of the plumbers in trying to burglarize the Ellsberg psychiatrist's office or the Coffee County officials who tampered with the machines. But the fact that they failed doesn't mean that it wasn't a serious and consequential crime, because in both cases, it was really an effort to undermine an election. Certainly in Watergate it was, when they were trying to record the Democratic National Committee office conversations. And it certainly is here, where they're trying to tamper with voting machine equipment. In Watergate, the three plumbers all were convicted of violating the civil rights of the psychiatrist. And of course, Hunt and Liddy, who oversaw it, were then later convicted in Watergate. But what was, for the burglary, but what was important is that trying to hide the initial criminal action really led a lot to the cover-up. And there's a cover-up here with the Trump's efforts in overturning the 2020 election.
No, and you make a very important point. I'm glad you did that. We should not lose sight of the smaller parts of this crime, alleged crime, and not lose sight of the big picture of what was attempted here. And that really is what I kind of wanted to close this conversation out with you, which is the big picture of what was attempted here. This attempt to undermine our democracy and overturn an election illegally. And I think back to when Nixon said in an interview with David Frost, famously, when the president does it, that means it is not illegal. Would you say that sentiment is still pervasive in our political culture, and certainly with somebody like Donald Trump?
Absolutely. It's permeating many of the defenses. You look at Mark Meadows, who says his case should be removed to federal court because he was acting at the president's bidding. And so many of the people who did these things believed the election lie, promulgated it with Trump, and said they were acting on the president's behalf. But a little lesson from Watergate. The chief of staff of President Nixon went to prison. His former attorney general went to prison. The burglars went to prison. Many others in the Nixon administration went to prison. The rule of law applied then, and hopefully it's going to apply now.
Yeah, certainly so, for the sake of our democracy and for our justice system. Michael Conway, it's always a pleasure, sir. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.